Yes, we are talking about here the death of Fidel Castro on Update Brazil. Castro, who died last night Pacific time. It might have been yesterday in Brazil time. And with me is, again, my co-host, Italo Lorenzen. And Italo, do we have any details about how Castro died?
No, we don't have this kind of details. We know that he gonna be cremated, so there will be no place of worship for him probably, and we know that the Cuban government decreed a 90 days mourn for the country.
My 90
So
days of mourning.
yeah,
Yeah.
9 days of mourning. So,
Well, that
Jeff, let me ask you a question. How's the mainstream media treating his death? Is the same as here in Brazil?
Well, it's the
In,
weekend
in,
here, and so the cable channels have mentioned it, of course, and but it's not going to get major treatment. We're not going to see until the commentaries about his death,
Mhm.
which are being written, I would assume, right now, and so we will see. But I can guess in the United States they play a funny game. There's a lot of sympathy for Castro among the media. What they may recycle and what we may expect to hear is how Castro was maligned as a communist before he really was, and that somehow President Eisenhower and President Kennedy drove him into the arms of the Soviet Union because they did not embrace his softer, kinder, gentler version of revolution, socialist revolution. So
Mhm.
that's kind of a predictable thing. As we know, the really traumatic events of the Castro regime occurred with the revolution, with the alignment with the Soviet Union, and of course with the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is quite famous, brought the world to the brink of
Mhm.
nuclear war when the Soviet Union moved intermediate range nuclear missiles and tactical nuclear missiles into Cuba, positioning them in a way which would have given Russia a significant advantage in a nuclear war. Only a flight time of only a few minutes to Washington from Havana, ability to obliterate many American cities virtually without warning of attack. Um, and
So,
this is
so
why President Kennedy quarantined Cuba at the time. What are they saying in the Brazilian media so far? There's probably nothing yet.
well, there is some, as I said, some parties that they 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 made some letters, open letters about how Fidel was a big leader and how he was an anti-imperialist warrior and a hero and etc. The media is being softer about Fidel than most of the mainstream most of the internet, sorry. On Facebook, we see lots of pages. They are celebrating his death as the death of a brutal dictator, etc. But the media is treating him like how can I say? As I said, they refuse to call him a dictator, and they refuse to call him uh, a communist. They refuse to somehow. Sometimes they say he was a socialist, and sometimes they just say that he was a nationalist. So they have this ambiguous view of
Mhm.
Fidel Castro. They don't want to compliment him too much, but they don't really want to tell what he really was. So they use these euphemisms.
Mhm.
Say that
Tot-
he's not a dictator. He was a ex-president, a former president, and this kind of
it's
language.
interesting. A Cuban National Socialist. It's funny how, because Marxism is so inaccessible as an ideology to most people, that they have to use the word socialism, the softer sounding word. People don't realize that philosophically and technically, uh, Marxism-Leninism is called scientific socialism. That was the technical
Mm-hmm.
term for it back in the 19th century. And that they don't quite understand that, of course, it is not nationalistic. But nationalism is popular. People love their country, love their own language, love their own traditions. And so it is a way for the communists to become accessible to the masses, to move this way. Hitler kind of guided them in this way because Hitler had created a form of totalitarian socialism in Germany, which was called National Socialism. And of course, it seems that all the quote unquote former communist regimes, China, Russia, and North Korea even, have moved in this National Socialist direction. That is, that they present themselves, I guess you could say,
Mm-hmm.
as Nazis, without
Mm-hmm.
the anti-Semitic racialist content. Um, but in truth, the more you look at these regimes, they're still Marxist-Leninists. They're still socialists. They won't drop. What's interesting in Russia and in China, they won't drop certain themes or certain ways of presenting themselves, which in
Mm-hmm.
Russia suggests that the communists have always been in power, that the Communist Party Soviet Union has been at work behind the scenes everywhere. And of course, the Communist Party of China, the Marxist-Leninist ruling party, is still openly the ruling party in China. And the same thing is true in Cuba, isn't it? I mean, the ruling party in Cuba is still well, what do they actually, what is the technical name for the Communist Party in Cuba? What do they call themselves?
Well, they call themselves the Communist Party of Cuba. So there is no ambiguity by on their
No,
side. You know,
no.
it's how the media treats them, and it's interesting. You said about how socialism is not nationalist, but they use the nationalist rhetoric in Latin America.
Yeah.
Actually, they use that as a way to frame U.S. as imperialist. So they use the rhetoric as a way to the nationalism of Latin America as an opposition to the USA imperialism. So they are the oppressed peoples, and they need to unite. They even come up with a concept, the Patria Grande, the great fatherland. Hugo Chavez was very keen to this concept. He used that a lot. It is the union of all Latin American peoples into one single flag, of course, a socialist flag, you
Hmm.
know. But he used this kind of this feeling, this nationalist feeling, there in the peoples of Latin America to say, okay, we are all nationalists because we want to unite the Latin American nation against the imperialism, the U.S. imperialism, the European imperialism, not the Russian, of course, but the U.S. and Europe, they were seen as enemies of the Latin American peoples as a whole, you know. So they use this rhetoric. They use that to unite the peoples in Latin America.
And what are the horrible crimes that the Americans are supposed to have, the North Americans, the United States is supposed to have committed against Latin America that makes us such a imperialist meanie?
Hmm. Well, first of all, they used to blame, especially here in Brazil. We have, since the left has controlled the universities for decades, the theory that the U.S. were behind the military coup here in Brazil in
Before?
1964. Yeah,
Mhm.
and actually all Latin American dictatorships, they were seen as puppets for the U.S. So this is how it starts. They blame U.S. for the military regimes, and of course they blame U.S. for the failures of the economic failures of the Latin American people. So they see this as uh, an example of how capitalism works. So the Latin America, the U.S. uses the Latin America just the way the European used the Africa as colonies. So they say that we are colonies of the U.S. and we are fighting against the colonizers.
Colonizers, yeah.
The colonizer,
That's
sorry.
it,
Yeah.
it is kind of baffling. I know you may have heard of this theory of course, it comes from Lenin, the neo-imperialism, the idea that you don't have to have overt occupation and the government being appointed openly and directly by the colonizing power. The idea is that economic control equals political control, and that U.S. economic dominance automatically means the exploitation of the country. The political government of the country is dictated by American corporations, etc., etc. Isn't this kind of how they present it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because in one hand they blame America for this economic hegemony, and in the other hand they blame America by not trading with Cuba. They blame America for their economical failure too. So they're you can either have market or not have market, you know.
That's pretty funny. Yeah, it is funny when you look at the dishonest propaganda and you see that if America trades with them, America is an imperialist country manipulating their country by trading with them. But if it doesn't trade with them, it's trying to destroy their economy and it's making war on them. That's
Precisely.
right. That's brilliant.
It's precisely how it works.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, this is enormously frustrating for someone like myself, who, when people talk about this concept of economic imperialism, you realize that when our countries all trade with each other, we all grow together. We not only grow together and become closer and more sensitive to each other politically, but we also grow economically together, and everybody benefits from that relationship. And of course, here in the United States, then this is a great irony. Trump was elected because the United States has been so considerate of its trading partners that it's given them unfair trading advantages where they can, lower their currencies, the exchange rate for their currencies to give them a trading advantage. And it's knocked American companies out. It's knocked out American jobs. It's destroyed It's created the Rust Belt, those states that flipped and didn't vote for Hillary Clinton, that voted for Donald Trump, like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, those states. It's very interesting that these are the people in America who hurt, that America willingly sacrificed its own economic interest and the interests of its own people for the sake of having these relationships, these trading relationships with not only Latin American countries, with China in particular, so that nobody really understands what the effect of these trading relationships are on the United States, except we just had a decisive election result because of them. And it's not economic imperialism by the United States. It's in fact a kind of economic altruism by the United States. And people ought to know this economic altruism began under President Eisenhower in the 1950s. And it began in a case like the cases of Japan and South Korea that really needed trading to trade with the United States, and they were manufacturing certain things much cheaper than could be manufactured in the United States, and allowing them to make those things, and then knocking out for example, the shoe industry in the United States. Shoe manufacturing was killed by the South Koreans back when I was a child. It started to happen, and by the time I was an adult, you didn't have very many shoes being made in the United States. They were all made in South Korea and other places. And this was a conscious decision by the U.S. government to prevent communism from coming to power in those countries, because, like you say, if we traded with them, we gave them some prosperity, we gave them a part in our economic system that then allowed them uh, uh, greater prosperity so that they wouldn't flip and have a communist revolution and so on. So indeed, it's a complicated issue, this whole trading thing, how it works.
So do you think this is what motivated the U.S. government to do this kind of altruism?
Yeah, it's to maintain the alliance. We did it with Germany as well. It's like, well, we need the Germans and the Japanese and the South Koreans to uh, have something positive that if they break their relation with the United States, they'll lose their trading partner, their most important trading partner. And so it's okay if the U.S. shoe industry goes down or the U.S. automobile industry takes a hit, uh, uh, so on and so forth, other industries as well. Because if we raise tariffs, they might just go with the Soviet Union. They might just change
Mm.
sides in the Cold War. And that was actually discussed when some of the minutes of the National Security Council meetings of the Eisenhower administration came out. This was kind of part of the actual conscious algebra of the Eisenhower administration. It's that if we don't trade with them, they might go over to the communist bloc. Of course, it was kind of overdone because we ended up hurting ourselves, and of course we did hurt ourselves, and I don't know to what extent it's kind of politically inevitable that this kind of thing would have developed in the US. Maybe it is, just as the counter movement under Trump seems kind of inevitable, although it's not. It depends on the personality of Donald Trump, I think, and his desire to do this.
Yeah. One thing that it made clear to me of this last election is that the U.S. developed some kind of guilty culture. You know, the people, especially people voting for Hillary, they vote for Hillary because they feel guilty about uh, how America have quote unquote dominated other countries. So they don't want this kind of they want to keep this kind of altruism
Hmm.
because they were imposed this kind of this line of thought that trade is imperialism. So it is to say that
Yes.
America today is one of the biggest anti-America country.
Oh,
Is,
absolutely.
is that correct? Okay.
That is correct. This guilt for, okay, the United States is one of the largest countries in terms of size and in terms of its economic development. It's the number one country in the world in terms of its size of its economy and economic development. And so Americans have turned their back. They've deindustrialized. Things aren't, made in America. Very high quality, good price, fair price. This was known all over the world. And all of a sudden, everything's made in China, and it's pretty shoddy. It's
Hmm.
very cheap, of course. And the United States shifted and became this financial power, which is, by the way, something that happened in Great Britain as Britain was entering its period of decline. It also adopted trading policies that were destructive of its economy, just like we did. Well, particularly during World War II, again, for military reasons. The shocking news about the Second World War was what Britain economically gave up to the United States in order to please the United States strategically and economically, because the United States was supporting Britain in the Second World War. It's almost like the same kind of logic in the Cold War developed with the United States itself. And feeling guilty about being this great economic power and also great military power after the Second World War uh, does seem to condition, especially American liberals in the left. Um, and of course, it's very weak-minded. And, Barack Obama was chastised by some people on the right here when he became president for going around the world and apologizing for the United States, which he most certainly did. He did it in his speech when he went to Egypt to the Muslim Brotherhood. He did it in Germany to the Europeans. And of course, the weakness of American leadership is exactly should be seen in with the sudden increase in Chinese and Russian political and military power and influence. which is become alarming in East Asia in regards to China, in Europe with regards to Russia.
I see. So again about Fidel Castro, I said that I don't believe this is going to be there is going to be a huge movement in Cuba because Fidel already transferred his power to Raul Castro. But I can feel that it can create a momentum in there. Do you agree with me? Do you have information about how is going to be uh, the political opposition inside Cuba, about how it's going?
Well, the theory was back, that Henry Kissinger sold Nixon on back in the early 1970s was the reason for developing a trading relationship with a communist country, whether that communist country was China or the Soviet Union, was because we would then corrupt them with capitalism. They would then get to understand freedom and understand us better, and communism would then become a joke that nobody would really follow it. But the truth of the matter is that in all communist countries, the diehard communists were always a minority, but they controlled the secret police and they had the methods to maintain political power, to assassinate their enemies. You look at Russia, when they went away from jailing dissidents, which they still do, using
Mhm.
false charges, they just started assassinating them. You had the assassination of Paul Klebnikov in Moscow, of Anna Politkovskaya, of Alexander Litvinenko. Those are just a few. I mean, there's dozens of journalists and also businessmen. They just simply gunned them down in the street. Former KGB officers have been become liberals, have had to escape abroad, or have had false charges put against them, thrown in jail. So the Chinese similarly still maintain strict laws, strict censorship of the internet, censorship of the press, so that we have decades now of experience, of political experience, showing us that introducing capitalism and trade with communist countries does not make them freer, does not bring them closer to democracy. Uh, Quite the contrary, it strengthens the regimes militarily and allows them to penetrate those countries they're trading with, penetrate Germany, penetrate France, Britain, the United States, and then have an effect on our political system, where we have a Barack Obama elected president or a Bill Clinton or a Hillary Clinton, and which our political system, look, they present themselves as Democrats here. And Hillary Clinton is not a Democrat, she's a Marxist. Barack Obama is not a Democrat, he's a communist. But people don't say, look, he was mentored by Frank Marshall Davis, that Frank Marshall Davis was a card-carrying communist. This is who taught Barack Obama his political ABCs. Barack Obama has never politically come out and said, oh, I was trained to be a communist when I was a teenager, and now I understand it's not true, I don't believe in it. No, Barack Obama says he was never a socialist. That's impossible. He attended socialist conferences in the 80s, socialist scholars conferences. When he was uh, a freshman at university here in California, before he went back east to go to school, he was known by people on campus to be part of campus communist groups. So Barack Obama is lying about who he is. He got into the Illinois legislature by taking over a seat of someone who was a communist friendly, who traveled to the Soviet Union, who wrote glowing things about the Communist Party Soviet Union. Trevor Loudon, in his book, The Enemy Within, his book about Barack Obama, shows all of these things. It is the same thing with your Workers' Party. Our Democratic Party has been taken over by the extreme left, by Marxists. And so Fidel Castro, sitting in Havana all these years, has been watching his side winning little by little. And their opening of trade with us is not the indication that Cuba is changing. It's the indication that the United States is the country that's changing.
I see. I see. So you don't believe that that Fidel's death weakens the regime at all?
it it could weaken the regime because of his prestige, but I think that we must be cautious about the possibility that they will use this to bring about the appearance of changes in Cuba, when the reality is the dictatorship and the communist ideology are still in control behind the scenes, and that rather the trick has been played on us. The game has been changed on us. And that's what concerns me, that we're going to go, oh, they're not communists anymore. And all of a sudden, we're going to get flooded with DGI agents, the Cuban KGB. And the companies that do business with them are going to become compromised. That legislation in the United States will be compromised. Politicians will be compromised. Our CIA and DIA will be infiltrated. We know the Defense Intelligence Agency was infiltrated by the Cubans before 9/11. We
Yeah,
know that because we caught one of the chief agents.
yeah, I see the moment that Cuba is going through right now as somehow similar to what Venezuela went through when Chavez died. It didn't weaken the regime at all. In fact, they made him somehow a saint. So I see that there is a chance. Well, he was 90, so he was going to die anytime soon anyway. So they were preparing for that anyway.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, they've had a
And
long time to prepare. You're absolutely right. And the one thing they do is that their political planning and preparations are very good. They know exactly how to tailor, they think very carefully how to tailor the images and the statements, and actually the choice of the words that they're using to convey a deceptive message. And they believe very much that all warfare is based on deception. Like the Russians and Chinese, I mean, the Cubans were trained by the Russians. They were trained by the Eastern Bloc, the Czechs and the Russians in particular. And they've been very good disciples. And you see what they did. They supported Hugo Chavez. Look at the deception in Nicaragua. They agreed to the democracy, to the peace process at the end of the war in the 1980s, that they were going to accept a democratic regime. But as soon as they realized, we had a Barack Obama in the White House, and as soon as they realized they could change the Constitution and recreate the Sandinista dictatorship in Nicaragua, and to reintroduce Russian military advisors and so on, they've done it. Nicaragua is a communist bloc country. It is under Russian military supervision, just like it was happening in the 1980s. It's all an instant replay. And the same man is in charge that was in charge in the 1980s. So Daniel Ortega is there. And of course, a friend of Fidel. Absolutely. And the same thing. And what is Maduro, the leader in Venezuela? We were talking earlier about nationalism, phony nationalism. I mean, hasn't it come up that he's not even Venezuelan? He was born in Colombia.
Yeah, totally. So I think we covered most of what we could possibly know about what Cuban government will look like in the following years. Again, I will stress this. We don't know exactly what they are going through, because it is a closed regime. It's different, for example, in the U.S. Then you can know, for example, the what Hillary is doing, because you have FBI investigating her, and we have the newspaper, and we have of course, the newspaper are very pro Hillary, but we have the internet, and we have the channels that they broadcast what is actually going on. Cuba doesn't have that. The same as North Korea, the same as Russia, the same as China. We have to analyze with little information. This is why it's so hard to predict what they're going to do.
Yeah, it is.
So go
Yeah,
on.
It is hard to predict. It's fascinating to watch them, because to try to predict what they're going to do, you can tell what they're going to do actually further in the future. But immediately their tactics are calculated to be impossible to anticipate, which is actually good. That's what good tactics are. Strategically, where they're going to be and how they're going to, for example, it was easy to see that Russia was going to rebuild its military back in the 90s. It was easy to see that. The signs were everywhere. Nobody saw that the intention was for Russia to have military ascendancy over Europe. It was easier to see with China, of course. But if you understood the logic of the regime, you understood that was happening. So even though it took 20 years or 25 years since 1991 to do it, you could see it, but you couldn't see the immediate tricks and backflips and pirouettes and whatnot that they were going to do in the meantime. That was always like, Boris Yeltsin is a drunk, and where's this Putin guy coming from? And they had this Prime Minister Kasyanov for a while, who was very pro-Western and spoke fluent English, and the Brits and the American companies loved him, and they played this game. It really was kind of fascinating to watch the dance, and the same kind of dance started with Raul Castro here with Barack Obama's visit to Cuba, and Fidel's death, I suppose, is part of the dance and how they will play it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I guess we're at the end of the show now, and I want to thank you, Italo, for being with me, discussing this important subject. I want to thank the viewers. If you like this video, click here. We had 2 parts in this video. So if you missed the first part, it should be out there, but we're going to try to link them on YouTube. Thank you for joining us on in America, what is our Thanksgiving holiday weekend, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week with another episode of Update Brazil.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.